So, I would like to welcome everybody to the May edition of Ask the Expert, our webinar series here at the Sidney Kimmel Comprehensive Cancer Center at Johns Hopkins Community Outreach and Engagement Program. We welcome you. If you are a mother, happy belated Mother's Day, and I hope you guys enjoyed your weekend. Dr. Azad, welcome. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you doing? It's
I am
nice to
well.
be here too.
I'm so glad you are here. We appreciate your time, and we look forward to diving in and having a in-depth conversation to increase our knowledge about clinical trials. So before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then end with one, fact that we'll remember you by at the end of this?
Sure. And I'm going to apologize in advance that I have a chronic cough like for the last month ever since I had a cold. So I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm probably going to cough through a lot of this conversation. But
No
so
worries.
I'm Nilo Azad. I'm a faculty member here at Johns Hopkins. I joined the faculty here in 2008, right out of fellowship. So I've been committed to Hopkins as the institution that I love and that I've been involved in for my entire academic career, my entire faculty career. Um, I consider my biggest role taking care of patients. So I'm in clinic a couple of days a week, taking care of GI cancer patients. So specifically, I take care of patients that have colon cancer as well as pancreas and biliary tract cancer. So those are the cancers that I predominantly care for. Um, but early on, I actually came to Johns Hopkins because I was very interested in how we could develop new drugs for cancer patients. And that's the training work that I did when I was at the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, where I did my training. So that's when I came here. And I started here. And within a year of starting here, we started an early drug development program where we really take drugs right out of the laboratory both from Johns Hopkins, but a lot of the drugs that we work with pharmaceutical company partners and moved them into clinical trials. So I've been running that group for many years here. And then just in January, I stepped away from that role to now be the person that helps direct clinical research for the whole cancer center. So not just early drugs and not just GI cancer, but hopefully I'm having line of sight over all different cancers and all the different kinds of clinical research that we do. That's not just developing drugs, but also developing new diagnostics. So, how do we diagnose cancer early? How do we deal with survivorship? So, when people are surviving cancer, how do we make sure that they have good quality lifestyles after cancer? Kind of all the pieces, anything that touches cancer and has to do with clinical research.
That sounds really exciting and rewarding at the same time. It's very awesome how you were able to take something and grow it throughout the career. I can't wait to see where we go from here. And
Yeah, absolutely.
you spoke about clinical trials. So, what is a clinical trial?
So, a clinical trial is basically a way that we test whether something helps people live longer or people have healthier lives. And so, it's a way that we can scientifically look and see whether something is true or not. So, is it true that if you eat this, it's not good for you? Is it true if you eat that, it's bad for you? Is it true if you take this drug, it increases your blood pressure or decreases your blood pressure, or it doesn't? So, those are the basics of clinical trials. In cancer care, our clinical trials are really focused on how can we help people get diagnosed earlier with cancer, maybe even prevent cancer. And then once they have it, what are the things that data tells us helps people live longer, helps cure patients? And if we can't cure them, how do they live longer? And so there's all different clinical trials. There's some where we are just watching patients and observing what they do in their normal lives and tracking whether that is beneficial or not. And then there's things where we actually give them drugs, right? We give them a medication and we see whether that helps somebody live longer or not.
Okay.
So clinical trials is an umbrella term that really encompasses a lot of different kinds of ways of trying to make people healthier.
So you would say that would be like the primary goal of what clinical trials, and in this particular case, cancer clinical trials. So if the primary goal is to look for new ways of treating cancer, how else do they differ? Clinical trials differ from standard treatments.
So, standard treatments have already been through clinical trials and have been proven to be effective at whatever they are saying that they're going to do, right? So, if we just take an example from what I do of colon cancer and how we treat colon cancer, a clinical trial could tell us that if you have a colon cancer and you do surgery and remove it, that person will be cured. That there was a clinical trial that showed that. Or there's a patient who, if they get their colon cancer removed, and they need to have chemotherapy, that the chemotherapy actually helps them. And so we did clinical trials to show which patients need chemotherapy and which patients don't. And in fact, there's a lot of patients with colon cancer that they just need surgery and they don't ever need chemotherapy. And that was shown in a clinical trial. So standard of care is sometimes giving people new options, and sometimes it's making sure that they're not having to go through treatments that don't work for them, and where they're going to be fine without it. So clinical trials can help us dissect what is actually true for the best way to treat patients.
So you said that, clinical trial, that our standard of care has already been through a clinical trial. What does that look like? Can you explain the phases of clinical trials and what a participant could expect in those phases?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to take the example of a new drug. So if there's a new drug and we're trying to understand whether that new drug works for patients or not, the first step of that is what's called a phase one trial. So there's four phases of studies. So the first phase of trials is the new drug comes out. It was tested in the laboratory. It worked in the laboratory to kill cancer cells, but now we need to see if it works in human beings. And the first step of that is to figure out what the right dose is to give patients. And so a phase one clinical trial is a clinical trial where we start very low in terms of dose to make sure we're not hurting anybody. And we slowly, slowly, slowly amp up the dose of the drug to get to a point where we have an acceptable number of side effects, because any drug is going to have side effects. And so we slowly go up. Every patient who's on one of these phase one clinical trials is going to be on a drug. And so there's no placebo. Everyone's getting the drug, but they might be getting it at different doses. And we'll get to a point where the dose is too high and there's too many side effects. And then we know that we've hit too many side effects and that's too high of a dose. So if you think of a phase one trial, the risk of a phase one trial is that maybe you'll get a dose that's too low, or maybe you'll get a dose that's too high. So the risk of a phase one trial is pretty high compared to the next phases of trials that we'll talk about. But the advantage is that it actually takes between 5 to 7 years to develop a new drug in the clinic with clinical trials. So a lot of cancer patients don't have the ability to wait 5 to 7 years for the next breakthrough. So it really gives people access to drugs maybe 5 years before the FDA would ever approve the drug. So that's why we do phase one trials and how we do phase one trials. And then after that comes the phase two trial. And that is, we've finished the phase one, we know the dose. We know exactly the right dose to give patients. But now we want to see if you give patients that dose, does it work or not? And so then you give it to all of a group of patients that have the same cancer. So in colon cancer, again, going back to what I know, but it could be in breast cancer, it could be in leukemia, whatever the cancer is, everybody's going to get the dose that we decided in phase one is the safe dose. And we're going to give it to a few dozen patients. And we're going to see at that dose, are we controlling cancer growth? Are we shrinking cancer? And if it looks good, and if it looks like we are controlling cancer, we are shrinking cancer, then the next and final step before FDA approval is a phase three trial. And that's the trials that most people think about, but really that's only one phase of trials. But that's when you get half and half of patients. So half of patients will get phase three trials, and half of patients, I'm sorry, that's my family just walking in the door. Let me just tell them to be quiet. Okay.
And I totally
Yeah.
understand.
So phase three trials are trials where if they're randomized. So usually nowadays, a computer will randomize you 50-50 to getting either the experimental drug that we're trying to learn, whether it's better than what's standard of care, and the other half of people get standard of care. So what the FDA wants to know is if we know that there are drugs that work, is this new drug better than what already works or not? And so you have to have a comparison, and so that's what a phase three trial is. And a lot of times those are blinded, meaning the patient and the doctor doesn't know whether you're getting the drug. But nowadays, a lot of times they're not blinded. You know exactly what you're getting, but you still only have a 50-50 chance of getting the experimental drug. But in those studies, the risk is the least because we know the dose. We
Hmm.
know that there's some early signs that it actually works in human beings. And even if you're randomized to the other arm, you're getting standard of care. So you're not going to be getting something that isn't the standard to get. And so that's the first three phases of clinical trials that gets a drug approved. The final phase of trials, phase four studies, that's after a drug is already approved. And that just means that the FDA, for the first many years after a drug is approved, it's going to continue to watch those trials and those drugs to make sure that the drug looks just as safe when it's been given to thousands of people than when you were in clinical trials and given to a few hundred. So that's just a safety mechanism. But by that point, it's already on the market and you can already get it.
That as a science girl, I still didn't know about the breakdown like that. And so we talk about risk, especially when we're talking about phase one. So when we're talking about risk, what makes a patient eligible and almost willing to take that leap to participate in a phase one trial, given that it has such high risk?
Can you say it again? Why would you participate or how do you?
Like, what would be the eligibility criteria that would encourage a patient or a doctor to make
Yeah.
that decision?
So the eligibility criteria for phase one trials can be a little different from study to study, but there are some baseline things that are going to be true no matter what. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that there are two major groups that are making sure that anything that we do is safe for patients and that we're not putting people at increased risk. And so one of those is the FDA, and the other, which is our government, that's overseeing all of these clinical trials. And the second is something called the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board, at every institution. So every institution has a group of people that their only job is to protect patients and protect them when they're on clinical trials. So every clinical trial makes promises to the IRB, makes promises to the FDA, and we call those promises eligibility. So that's what, when you were speaking of eligibility, that's what eligibility means. It means that we commit before we ever put a patient on trial that we are going to stick to these criteria to protect patient. And
Right.
so if you're going to try a new drug, you want to make sure that a patient has enough reserve, that they're strong enough that if you have some unexpected side effects, because these are new drugs, that you're going to, that patient is at the lowest risk of something really bad happening to them, right? Because that's what our biggest mission is, to protect patients no matter what. So the eligibility criteria, to your question, for patients that go on phase one studies, and I've got to tell you, all trials, this is true across studies, these are, on one hand, they're going to be laboratory values that make sure that you already have good organ function, that you have good kidney function, good liver function, that your blood counts are okay. All of these things, and it's really to protect patients. It's to make sure that people have enough reserve. The other things that we'll make sure is that somebody is strong enough, they're active enough, so that if they get a little more tired because they're on a clinical trial, that's not going to take them from being a really fit functional person to being somebody who's really exhausted and not able to have good quality of life, or anything dangerous happening to them. So those are pretty standard across all eligibility. Then we have other eligibility for different drugs. So if you're giving a patient a drug that's going to amp up their immune system, we call that immunotherapy, but drugs that are turning your own immune system on against the cancer, then we're going to want to make sure that patients don't already have an underlying problem that makes them more likely to attack their normal cells. That's what we don't want to happen. And so sometimes those trials will say, well, look, if you already have lupus, if you already have scleroderma, if you already have some diseases where we know that you're more prone for your body to be attacking itself, this is not a trial for you because that's not going to be safe. Right. So, for every drug, based on what that drug does, we have extra eligibility that is really, again, about patient safety.
Okay. And so when we talk about being in the trials, like how are participants selected and what factors might exclude somebody? You touched on previous prior existing conditions. So what other things might exclude somebody, and are the eligibility requirements or the way a patient is selected, or is it different from phase 1 to phase 3?
Yeah, just being as open and transparent as possible. My feeling is that the biggest reason that people go onto clinical trials is because they are being taken care of by a doctor that believes in clinical trials or has access to clinical trials themselves. So, one of the things that, when you look at the discrepancy between the number of children who have cancer that go on clinical trials, which is the vast majority of children that have any cancer go on a clinical trial, most of those children are being treated by doctors in large academic centers or even in private practice, doctors that take care of children. That's part of their ethic. It's part of their normal practice to enroll children in clinical trials. In adults, it's been a little different. In adults, the vast majority of people that have a cancer do not go on clinical trials. And part of the reason is because there's so many people that cancer is such a huge national health issue that we have so many patients that have to be treated. They can't all be treated in academic centers, and community doctors that are treating patients in the community are taking care of a large volume of patients, and they may not be opening clinical trials. So the actual answer to your question, and I'm just being transparent, I think is it's actually access to trials that is the biggest hurdle for people to go on clinical trials. If within that, though, if you're at a place where people have a lot of clinical trials or you're being taken care of by doctors that really think about clinical trials early in terms of options, then these are the things that they're looking for. What are the good treatments that already are exist for this cancer, and are they so good that we don't actually have clinical trials in that space? Because we do, early colon cancer, stage 1 colon cancer, there's almost no clinical trials in that space because 99% of patients are cured of that just by a surgery. And so we don't really have clinical trials in that space. Or do people have other health conditions that make them at too high risk? Like if they have uncontrolled high blood pressure or heart failure or diabetes, and the drugs that we're thinking about giving them could interfere with that. If their blood counts, like I was telling you, aren't appropriate. So there's a whole bunch of medical reasons, but the most common reason that a patient enrolls in a clinical trial is because of where and who they're being treated by.
And do you think that being treated by a provider who participates in clinical trials produces better outcomes?
I think that actually really depends on what the cancer is. I think that the vast majority of people that are treated in the community are treated very well. And even those patients that don't ever enroll in a clinical trial, many of those patients are still cured of their cancer. And so I don't want to say that being treated and being put on a clinical trial necessarily means that someone is going to get better care or that they're going to do better. But I do think that there is a hope in our community that at some point we're going to get rid of cancer, that we're going to be able to diagnose everything, early or even before it's cancer. And for people who are diagnosed with cancer, that will have such effective treatments that it will be able to eradicate cancer. And so in service of that goal, we have to participate in clinical trials. And then the last reality is, depending on what the cancer is, we have too many cancers, unfortunately, that right now don't have good enough treatments. And so there is a huge necessity for clinical trials in these cancers that are the leading cancer killers. And so that still means that people do, in that setting, I think, get better access and better treatment because they get access to novel drugs, to new drugs, right? That when the old drugs aren't so good.
Understood. And so the last question about this topic, what are some of like the risks and benefits for a patient that participates? I know in the clinical trials. I know we talked about their eligibility and things that they need health-wise, but what kind of risks or and even benefits aside from, I guess, curing the cancer?
So I'm going to talk about benefits first because I think there are so many benefits to participating in a clinical trial. And one of them I already talked about, which is getting early access to drugs that could be years away that are very promising. So I think that that is a huge benefit to being on a clinical trial. I also think that there is the possibility that by being involved in clinical trials, that you might be able to have treatment that has less side effects, less toxicity, and so you have a better quality of life depending on what the drug is. If you are on a clinical trial, there's a clinical trial team that takes care of you. So that usually involves a specialized research nurse or a research coordinator. So you actually get more specialized in care. You get kind of a navigator who helps you, and that person actually has very few patients that they take care of, and all of their energy is spent on the patients on the clinical trial that they are taking care of. So you get some extra personalized attention that during the time that you're dealing with cancer is such a nice feature because it's such a frightening and exhausting time. There's so much emotion around it, and so a little bit more support and care absolutely comes with clinical trial participation. Um, and so I think, and of course, we hope that some of these drugs really improve outcomes. So there's the hope that you really will do better, that you have a chance of maybe being cured of a cancer or at least living much longer with with the cancer. And that's why we do these trials. On the risk side, there are risks. And the risk side is that you might do a treatment that doesn't work as well, or that has a lot of side effects. We try to decrease that risk substantially by how we how we choose eligibility, and then how we also, as I said, in the randomized studies that are the largest and most common studies people participate in, everyone at least gets the standard of care. And so we do everything we can to minimize the risk. But the truth is that if you're on a study of a new drug, and it's only been given to a few dozen or a few hundred patients, you're still early on in us learning about what the side effects are and how to manage it. And that's a risk that we're very aware of, and that's why those nurses that are taking care of the patients take care of so few patients so they can be right on top of it. But that is, I think, a part of some of what we think about in terms of the risk we counsel patients about.
So now that we have some background about what a clinical trial is, let's talk about some of the hesitation that our community usually has with participating in clinical trials. How do, in you particular, how do you address the concerns and the fears that the community may have about actually participating in clinical trials?
Well, I think the first step is, and hopefully I'm doing that even in this first half hour that we're talking, is to be really open and transparent about the pros and cons of these really important choices during a very difficult time in patients' lives. And so I'm a glass half full person, but that doesn't mean that I should be walking into a room and pretending that some of these other worries aren't there. And so I try very hard, and I think a lot of investigators and scientists that are also taking care of patients, we are doctors first. So our mission first is to take care of patients and do what is best for them with them, that is consistent with their goals, right? And so learning about your patient and what a patient's goals are, and then talking to them and saying, look, these are your options. part of any clinical trial is to tell you what your standard options are. And here, I did this just today in clinic. I had a patient who I was talking about a clinical trial with, and I said, we have a fork in the road. One fork is to do the trial, one fork is not to. Here's what's positive, and here's what's negative about the trial. And here's what's positive, and here's what's negative about the standard of care. Let's weigh these together and giving people all of the information so they are really empowered to make a choice and have their doctors there as backup for that choice. And so I think the second part of it is backing up people's choice. And so if someone is really scared about doing a clinical trial, I see this all the time. I try to talk through those fears. If I talk through those and someone still isn't there, then I am wholly supportive of them being treated however they want to be treated, including on clinical trials. I mean, including standard of care, right?
Right.
So it's about respect and respecting people's goals and choices, and that's what we try to do. And we went into this field because we want to take care of people during this time. And there is no right way to do it in terms of a patient making a decision. There's just options, right? And
Right.
so we are here to tell you options and then to help you, once you make your choice, feel good about that option as openly and honestly and supportively as we can.
That's, that's great. You actually answered a couple of my questions in that answer. Because now what, moving forward as the community, what are some things that we can think about as far as strategies to help implement, maybe not as the community, but perhaps like in the healthcare world? You mentioned your example of letting your patient know you have the fork in the road and, we can go left or we can go right. But what do you think some major strategies could be, like a blanket statement for providers when wanting to try to build that trust with trial patients and people wanting to get into trials?
I mean, I think that we have a tendency to try to make things as simple as possible and say that people who don't want to do clinical trials, they're not doing it for these three reasons, and that there's a solution for that by addressing those three solutions. But I actually think that it's quite complex and nuanced, and I think every person is different. And so I'm not sure that I can say that there's one message that we can communicate that can help people say that, yes, I want to do a clinical trial. I think the underlying message we have to communicate is we are your doctors and your providers, and we're here to work with you to do what's best for you. And we're going to give you many options, and we respect whatever the choice is. And I think it's about that dialogue. It's about the dialogue that we acknowledge there's a lot of ways to look at this, that there are historical reasons that there is distrust. There is a worry about, people feeling like they're guinea pigs. I hear that a lot, like, why should I be the guinea pig for this? And there are real worries about people not getting the best care because they're choosing being on a clinical trial. So I think addressing that, but then also having conversations to say, but are those your worries, or do you have other worries? Do you have a friend that did a clinical trial and it didn't go well? Do you what are the other experiences that are making you think this way? And can I talk you through any of those? And sometimes, many times, we get to the other side of that and people feel really good about being able to talk through it and let go of a fear. And sometimes it doesn't work that way, and people still are reticent or, not wanting to go in that direction. And that's also okay. I do think that, I mean, my mission, my work is focused on doing clinical trials work. And so I hope I'm not, making people feel like this isn't something worth doing and thinking about. But I don't want I think pressure is not the right way. I think transparency and enthusiasm and, talking to people, I sometimes will call patients even before they've had their first doctor's appointment at Hopkins when I know there's a trial for them and just tell them why I'm excited about this drug. And then they come into the appointment being able to ask questions and it's not just being kind of launched at them. And I think that that's really helpful.
That is a great idea, to kind of, plant the seed ahead of time and let people kind of marinate on it before actually coming in so that they can develop questions. I think it is intense when you go to the doctor, even just any kind of procedure or standard of care. It's intimidating sometimes because it's like, this is a lot of information. So I know we talk about transparency and getting people the knowledge. So we talked a little bit back about IRB and about the FDA, but what are like, how can is a patient safety ensured throughout the clinical trial? Like, what are some of the things that IRB or the FDA ensure the patient safety?
So before a patient is even enrolled on a clinical trial, what a clinical trial is actually a written down document, right? So it's a contract. So we make a contract that is a contract with the FDA. It's actually a legal contract that it's with the FDA, and then we run it through internally, and goes through that IRB as well that we are talking about, where we lay out not only the eligibility, we lay out why are we doing this trial? We justify it. We say this is the science that says that this is worth studying in patients. Then we write out who we're going to enroll to the letter of the law. Like this is the exact hemoglobin or this is the exact kidney function that a patient has to have. There's zero flexibility. There's no fudging it. This is exactly what we're going to stick to. We make a promise. It's a contract. And it also in that protocol is safety. So we build into that if a person has this side effect, this is what we're going to do. And we explicitly say we will give this medicine to help with this side effect. We will hold the drug for this many days. We will check labs this often. These are the tests that we'll do if this is abnormal. So it is 100-page document on average where we lay out in painstaking detail every eventuality that we can think about to protect patients and to make sure that anything that happens to them, we've created a contingency plan for. And then we give that document to the FDA, and if once they approve it and our IRB approves it, only then can the very first patient be treated. And so this is something that we do and we take very seriously. Then the trial opens, and how do they know that you're sticking to it, right? So like it's one thing to sign a contract, it's another thing to make sure that people are abiding by the contract. Now, I would like to say that doctors are ethical people that are, very interested in making sure that they follow the rules. We're all rule followers. That's why we ended up where we did. But we don't just go on trust. So then every few months or at a minimum every year, but usually every few months, depending on the study, we have to submit every side effect that happens to patients, every single thing that happened to a patient, and we have to submit it to these external groups that are basically auditing us. So they're watching us. They're not involved in the trial in any way, and they're just making sure that we are doing what we promised that we would do. We also have to submit that every single year to the FDA. And if you don't do what you said you're going to do, they will shut your trial down, and they can actually shut you down as an investigator and not let you do any more clinical trials. And they can even shut an institution down and say, this institution. So you can imagine that when there's that much riding on it, that every institution has many measures that they build in to make sure that we are watching for patient safety. The final thing I want to mention is that companies and pharmaceutical companies are doing a lot of the work. They're doing yeoman's work these days in terms of being able to run clinical trials with academic partners like us. And those people have outside entities that they've hired that follow patients every single week. And so I am on calls for my clinical trials every single week with investigators, which is doctors across the country who are enrolling patients in the same trials. And we are going over every single patient that's enrolled. What are their side effects? Are we seeing any trends? What is the good way to manage it? And so there are actually so many layers built into the protection of patients that we do to make sure that we're doing everything on the up and up.
Okay, I'm gonna pause on my questions because I have a couple questions in our Q&A. So my first question is going to be, can you speak a little bit about decentralized clinical trials and how they emerged during and after COVID? Why are these important to patients who don't have access to clinical trials?
So, you know what I said it earlier, just a little bit ago, that my concern is that the biggest reason that a patient enrolls in a clinical trial is because they have access to doctors and to an institution that does clinical trials. And so, COVID really jump started a few things that I think have actually been very good for our research community, even though COVID itself was so tragic. And one of the things that it did was it said we were in a scenario where people had, first of all, we had a lot of people coming down with a terrible illness all at once. And it was being taken care of all across the country in small hospitals, big hospitals, community settings, academic settings. And so we had to try to learn as quickly as possible how we could help treat patients. And so what we did was this idea of decentralized clinical trials, which was studying people where they actually get treated and treating people with new drugs where they're actually being treated. And so if you all remember, that as we were learning about some of the new antibodies that treat COVID, the new drugs, we and many places around the world set up out or outdoor centers where you could come and get the antibodies done, where they could be studied, but hundreds of patients could be treated, even in these tent hospitals. And so the idea of a decentralized trial is a trial where everybody doesn't have to go to this one central place like Baltimore campus of Johns Hopkins to be treated. And so COVID is, now hopefully in the past, but the lessons that we've learned from that is that we can do some of this. We can do clinical trials in the community. And so we can do work where patients don't have to drive. Or fly or do the things that they have to do to have access. So that's the idea of decentralized trials. The reality of it is it's still only a small proportion of trials right now. But the goal is over time that we'll be able to do more and more of this work, in your neighborhood rather than having it to be at a big academic center.
So being that Johns Hopkins is a big academic center, do we participate in do we have any community oncologists either in the state of Maryland, outside of Baltimore or outside of the state?
Yes, we have collaborative relationships of all sorts with people and many different institutions and practices across Maryland and even in Pennsylvania and Virginia. We are part of something called the NCTN, which is the National Organization of Doing Cooperative Studies. We are one site of that, but there's 1,000 sites across the country, and we open clinical trials that are both open here in East Baltimore, open at Sibley, open at Green Spring, and open at kind of sites across the enterprise. The enterprise is the Johns Hopkins enterprise, but we also have deep relationships with Allegheny. We have, which is in Pennsylvania. We have had relationships with Anne Arundel and the centers there, and so we have many relationships and there are clinical trials associated with them as well. They're all different kinds of studies. So some studies are, the more intense brand new drugs right out of the lab, the kind of work I do. Most of that is pretty centralized in East Baltimore because it is so new that we have to be, we really have to have very specialized kind of staff that do that. But a lot of our trials that are really in phase 3 testing or even in that phase 4 I was talking about, new technologies that we're testing, those can be done all across this area.
That's very exciting to
Yeah.
see how something like you mentioned, so tragic, like COVID, was able to kind of mobilize a lot of things, including our ability to do trials. That was a very good question. Thank you for asking that. And the next question that I have in the chat is, if a participant is borderline, has a borderline level, maybe it's their blood levels that kind of put them on the cusp of being able to participate in a clinical trial. Is there any way like a doctor can appeal this to get their patient into the trial if they believe it's still safe?
Um, Generally, the answer to that is no. There have been some rare exceptions that have happened because the eligibility was actually wrong. Like
Mhm.
if somebody wrote an eligibility and they made it too tight and they excluded a group of patients that they really shouldn't have excluded, that every patient in that situation with that particular lab value or that particular problem should have been allowed on it. So I'll give an example of patients that are HIV positive. So for a long time in cancer clinical trials, we were excluding any patient that was HIV positive because of a theoretical worry that some of the HIV drugs that we give would have drug interactions with chemotherapy, new chemotherapy drugs. Well, it turns out that they almost none of them do. And so many protocols had to be amended to allow for people that were HIV positive to be able to go on the study because it wasn't fair to exclude them when they really weren't at any increased risk. So that is an example of an exception, but and it requires an amendment, and it's really about bringing a whole group of people that should have been allowed to be on the study, or at least we now know they should be allowed. We now know it's safe, right? Um, on the other hand, if you think of someone who's got border something where we really do want to be tightly hewn to that that lab value for people's safety, and someone's just on the margin of that, and we kind of want to say, well, like, it's just 0.1 difference or whatever, that is when there is usually no exception because we've got to draw a line. And of course, it's a slippery slope if you start saying, well, this small difference doesn't matter, this small difference doesn't matter. And the last thing I'll mention is that we all really care about our patients. And so if you ask a doctor that's taking care of a patient, and there's actually data around this, like they've studied this, if you ask a doctor about a patient that they really care about already, and you're talking about the difference between them being able to do a clinical trial that the doctor really wants for them versus not, they have a bias. They have a bias to saying that the patient is actually more well and is going to be more able to tolerate it, even with the same blood work and the same everything, as somebody who, if you're just looking at it on paper. And that's because we care about patients. That's why we go into this. And so it's really to almost protect patients from that bias of their doctors who really
Right.
care about them and are trying to kind of, grease the system a little bit for them.
That makes sense. And it's bless their hearts for being
Yeah.
kind of their patients. But I can see what you mean about how that can, get cumbersome and
And we've all done it. Like I have tried to do it so many times. And, I get into my feels about a person, about my patients, and I'm just like, I want this for them, and it is good that there is an objective, way that people are like, no, like this
right.
isn't right, to
And
do. It's
that
not
that goes
fair
back
to
to
do.
that goes back to kind of protecting, your patients and the ethical guidelines
Yeah.
kind of taps on that. We have another question in the chat, and it says, how does representation play a role in clinical trials? And with the new procedures or policies coming from the White House, how will that affect representation, if at all?
So there's been a curve of what has happened in this space. And so for the majority of for the majority of time, underrepresented populations in many different areas of civic life were also underrepresented in clinical trials and definitely in science. And it wasn't just race, and generally, even more associated with education and where people live, right, and rural versus urban. Over the last 10 years, there's been much more emphasis, funding, interest, work being done on improving access and kind of health literacy around clinical trials, and trying and each cancer center has been held to metrics about, hey, how many patients are you enrolling from groups that are traditionally underrepresented? Show us progress year on year. And so every time that we would go in front of the NCI and say that every 5 years we would go in front of the NCI to justify being a comprehensive cancer center, and not just us, across the country, all the comprehensive cancer centers and cancer centers. And we were asked these questions, and we were asked to make, and it helped us plan and make plans, and we were held to these metrics. We don't know what this White House is going to do around the metrics, right? But what we know is what we care about as an institution, and we care about these issues as an institution. So we are going to keep on keeping on, and we're going to keep working at what we can do to make sure that we are offering our studies to all patients, and that we are continuing to and growing our representation from groups that have been underrepresented. But whether or not we can use those metrics in our grants any longer, this administration, I don't have to tell you, has just turned everything on its side. But I have been very proud of Johns Hopkins and many institutions to say, like, you can do whatever you want to do as the White House and the administration, but we have our values as an institution and what matters to us, and we're just going to do that, you know.
Yes. So one more question in the chat that popped up. It says, some doctors don't look to clinical trials until the standard of care is no longer working. Can a patient go outside of their own doctor and find clinical trials themselves? And if so, how do they find them?
Yes, absolutely you can. And I myself find myself very frustrated by patients that could have been sent to us, years in their diagnosis earlier. So I absolutely acknowledge this mentality of, well, I'll do everything I possibly can do. And a doctor's mentality of saying, I'll do everything I can possibly do, and only when I run out of options will I send this patient on to somebody else. So I tell my patients, and I say this as someone who works at this particular amazing institution with so many clinical trial options, and I tell my patients that they should all consider getting a second opinion, because a cancer diagnosis is a serious diagnosis. Even if it's an early diagnosis, it's a serious diagnosis. And why not get at least one other person's opinion, especially someone who might be a thought leader in the field? And so that is, I think, the best way that you can get access to the idea of clinical trials and talk through when you should be looking at them and what the options are. Generally speaking, if you're going to get a second opinion in cancer, I would say go get a second opinion somewhere where they are doing this kind of work, right? And there's so many places all across the country. So even if, for the second opinion, you're driving 2 hours or 4 hours, if you can do it, it might really be worth it just for that conversation. I wish that our national system of searching for clinical trials by yourself was better. It is possible. There are databases that exist that are publicly available. The biggest one is called clinicaltrials.gov, and that is run by the government, and every clinical trial has to be registered on clinicaltrials.gov. So that website has basic information about what the trial is, some brief eligibility, like who they are looking for and where the trial is open, but it is missing so many pieces. Like, how often do you have to be there? When, is the trial still enrolling today? There's all these pieces that are missing. So if you type in your kind of cancer, you might get 300 clinical trials that come up even just in your state. How do you sift through those and see which are good or bad? That's really hard. Different advocacy organizations. So the patient advocacy organizations have really tried to take this on. And so again, depending on the kind of cancer that a patient has, you might be able to go, the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation, which is biliary tract cancer, has a beautiful clinical trials finder that you can use. And they have a human being that you can talk to, and you can actually reach out to them and say, I have had cancer, I've had this treatment, what should I be looking at? And they give you advice and they help sift through things. And so that's the same thing for, many different kinds of cancer have that kind of advocacy. But even listening to me, you hear like how hit or miss it is. And it can be very daunting to try to figure all this out. My parents are in their 80s. Like my parents could never figure all this out. Like I can barely get my mom to like understand how to like answer her text messages. So it just really, I think it does put a lot of pressure and onus on patients to do things that can be really difficult to do. And that's why out of all of these solutions, I think going and talking to a doctor at a place that runs clinical trials is potentially the easiest, but these are some other options that you can pursue as well.
That's great. And does Hopkins have a site? I think I've seen like, hopkinsmedicine.org/clinical trials. Is that a good source to use?
It's an okay source to use. So it's not great. It's okay. And the reason it's not great is the same reason that all clinical trial finders are hard, is that it's just hard to keep it up to date, right? And so there's a lot on that, and there's a lot about what we have available here. So that's very good, but it's not going to give you options at University of Pennsylvania or in Nebraska. It's not going to give you options at University of Maryland. And so it's pretty good for what we have. And but for the most comprehensive one, it's clinicaltrials.gov.
Okay. And so as we wrap up this interview, what can the community do to I guess either promote the idea of participating or at least having the conversation about clinical trials? What could be our call to action for the people on this call going forward?
I think that talking with people about how clinical trials are a part of everyday care of cancer patients in every line of therapy, there is that clinical trials should be considered. And it doesn't, and having the conversation does not mean that you have to do it. It means that it gives you options. And I think the more we can message around open communication with your doctors, that you're thinking about clinical trials, it will make your doctors think about it too, because they'll know that that is something that you're interested in. So I think for, the people that are on this call are already more engaged than 99% of people in terms of thinking about cancer and clinical trials. And so if we can take this group of people that's very motivated to understand what we can do better for cancer patients and
Mhm.
just amplify our voices around open communication with your doctors. I just really think that that is the fundamental. I think it's the fundamental for clinical trials, and I think it's the fundamental for cancer care. And one of the things that I really want for all of our patients is to have that kind of a trusting relationship, where they can really talk about, chew on all of these really complicated things together with their doctors.
Oh, so somebody asked in the chat, not the clinicaltrials.gov site, but you mentioned a patient-friendly site that lists clinical trials, and have people that can engage.
So
They just want the site so that I can put it in the chat.
yeah, so the one I was talking about specifically was for the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation. So it's for patients that have this particular cancer, cholangiocarcinoma, which is bile duct cancer, gallbladder cancer, and that's the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation, .org, cholangio.org. But Colorectal Cancer Alliance has a clinical trials finder. The breast cancer advocacy groups have clinical trial finders. So each entity is different and more or less resourced, and so part of that is if someone is diagnosed with cancer, engaging with the patient advocacy community, because you can learn so much from your other patients that have been through this about what some of the resources are. I'm not as great of a resource to tell you if you have prostate cancer, what are the prostate cancer organizations that really do a good job of organizing clinical trials, but somebody who has prostate cancer and is part of that advocacy community might be a great resource.
That's a wonderful point, and it also brings it back to relying on the community and us kind of sharing information with each other. Dr. Azad, this has been an amazing talk. I appreciate you so much. You are a wealth of information and knowledge, and I am I'm floored
Thank,
at what the things that I've learned today. There's some things I thought I knew about clinical trials, and you proved me wrong today. So thank you so so much. Um,
thank you very much.
we
I
appreciate your time.
I want to thank everyone who joined too from 6 to 7 p.m. I really appreciate you spending an hour with me. So thank you.
Yes, thank you for our audience. We appreciate you. We will be back next month. We will be talking to a breast cancer survivor. So please be on the lookout for that flyer and registration. Thank you so much. And again, you're getting thank yous, and this was wonderful in our comments. So thank you so much, Dr. Azad. Have a great evening.
Thank you. You too. Bye bye.
Bye, everyone.